Well, I'm just testing this recording of two romantic poets finding God in nature. So I'm re-recording to see if this records over what I just said. Thank you. Hello and welcome to this recorded lecture on two romantic poets, William Wordsworth and William Blake, and some of their antecedents and fellow travelers for CH 202, spring 2017. I'm David Fenimore. You can't really talk about the Romantics without talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Ha 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 ha. Now, Rousseau asked this question that hadn't really been asked before in the history of Western civilization, is that has the new science and the machines that it has led to, and this is, remember, in Rousseau's day, 1755, so the technology not exactly what we're talking about, has this advance improved human life? And Rousseau asks the question rhetorically, who's stronger? Who's healthier? Who is more moral? Civilized man or savage man? Referring perhaps to the indigenous inhabitants of North America, who Europeans had been coming into contact with over the previous centuries. Who's stronger? Who could win in a fight? Obviously, Rousseau thinks that civilization has made humans weaker. And not just weaker, but less happy, too. He asks, are disease, the problems of crime, people in abject poverty, and unequal political rights, are these things natural? And when Rousseau uses the word natural, he's using it now in a very different way than it had been used by Bacon and Descartes. Natural, or nature, in the sense of inhuman nature, in the sense of trees and flowers and animals and mountains, not nature in the sense of the physical universe, as science had been defining it. And of course, Rousseau's answer to this question that he asks is, no, this is not natural. Remember that last line in the essay on the origins of political inequality. He says, it is against the law of nature that a few people have all the goods and so many people lack the basic necessities of life. So if this is a problem, asks Rousseau, why is there civilization to begin with? Why do we have civilization? And his answer, you may remember from reading that essay, private property. The first person that said, this is mine, led to the founding of civil society. And if somebody had just pushed him aside and said, you're a fool, then we'd still be in this happy primitive state, at least as Rousseau defines it, nature. So you can't talk about the Romantics without talking about Rousseau writing about 50 years before Blake and Wordsworth. But you also can't talk about the French Revolution without Rousseau. Remember, the political social structure of France was a little less advanced than that in England. France had the first estate, the priests and nobles. That's actually the second estate, the priests. First estate, the nobles, and the third estate, the peasants. And this is an engraving about the time that Rousseau wrote that essay, showing how the first two estates were oppressing the third estate. What did this oppression lead to? Just a little over 30 years later, there's the head of Louis the 16th of France, the king whose head is chopped off along with about 15 or 20,000 other aristocrats in France. Off with their heads, cried the Revolutionary Council. And the French Revolution, which was in part inspired by the American Revolution, but far bloodier and more terrible, led to a realigning of the politics of Europe for the entire next century. For all of the 1800s, revolutions, although not usually this bloody, were springing up all over Europe, and various colonies in South America were declaring their independence and sometimes fighting for it from the European colonizers. And this is the other legacy of Rousseau. But we're looking today at Rousseau's legacy in the field of art and culture. And you've seen this painting before, I think. It's a famous painting of a bucolic, idyllic, pastoral scene in England. You see the humble peasant's cottage, somewhat romanticized. Have you ever wondered where the paintings of Thomas Kincaid came from. This is the style from which Kincaid is working. This picturesque, romantic view. There's the peasant with his wagon stuck in the mud, but it seems to be a happy, idyllic place. You get a hint over there in the far distance of the clouds rising, the majesty of nature, something mysterious back there, but it's still a very human scale picture. And it shows that by the time the constable was painting, people saw something in nature, something that was at least as good as science, at least as good as civilization. Wordsworth would write in that poem that we will be reading in just a moment here, let nature be your teacher. Turn away from schools. Stop reading so many books. Stop doing science. Go out into nature and let nature tell you what you need to know. Well, the idea of what nature could tell us was changing at this time too, and one of the early prophets of a new view of nature was a guy named Edmund Burke, who wrote a whole bunch of different stuff. He was a fairly conservative English writer. He wrote about aesthetics, he wrote about politics, but in particular, we're reading an essay he wrote, or part of it, called Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, which he wrote at about the same time that Rousseau was writing down in France. And in this essay, Rousseau argues that we can categorize the various emotional responses we have to nature and art. And notice that he's talking about emotional responses, not intellectual responses, not talking about the same sort of scientific inquiry into nature that we've been seeing with the early natural philosophers of the scientific revolution. No, he's talking about how we feel, how the individual viewer is affected by seeing nature and representations of nature in art, painting mostly, but also literature. And Burke classifies these responses based on the type of object to which the viewer is responding to. And he invents these two categories, the beautiful, or sometimes it's called the picturesque, and the sublime. And he categorizes these types of objects in nature according to how they make us feel, the passions, as he calls them. And he analyzes the effects of the beautiful and the types of objects which give us feelings he categorizes as beautiful, and the types of objects that gives us feeling that he categorizes as sublime. And lest you think this is some, erudite, airy-fairy philosophy, Burke points out that, these ideas are different, and you should not forget the difference if it's your business to affect the passions, i.e., if you're a novelist, a painter, if you're trying to affect people emotionally and grab them. Some of these ideas still relevant today as we see screenwriters and video producers trying to attract our attention. We see advertising executives, marketing people trying to ring emotional chords in us. And some of Burke's aesthetic theory here may still be useful. So he divides these categories up in this way. He starts with the beautiful, or what some people call the picturesque. These, he says, are objects that are small, they're smooth, and they're delicate and light, and they're on a human scale. They're on the scale of human beings, that's something that we can behold or stand next to or sit beside. And they give us feelings of pleasure, of joy, and attract our attention. But he says the sublime always dwells on great objects, perhaps even infinite objects, huge objects, mountains and planets and galaxies, things on an inhuman scale, far bigger and stranger than human beings. And these produce feelings of fear in us and even pain. He talks about the terror and the horror that the sublime engenders in our responses, and it forces our attention. And Burke says that what's important is not what we think about these things, but what we feel about them, our emotional responses. Remember how Descartes dismisses the emotions and talks about analysis and mapping and analytic geometry. Burke is saying, no. What's important is the feelings in the individual viewer. And he says that of these two categories, the feelings aroused by the sublime are deeper and more important. He associates them with self-preservation, and says that these are the types of emotional responses that make a real impact on us. So you've seen this painting many times before. You saw it a few minutes ago, the Hay Wain. And you can see the tradition which it's coming out of. This is a much older painting. Thomas Gainsborough's Connard Wood, about 70 years before Constable's The Hay Wain. But it's the same sort of idea. Nature on a human scale. Nature is something familiar, something almost friendly. Now contrast this painting, made the same year that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein over in Germany by Caspar Friedrich. Notice the different experiences of nature. Nature is immense. Nature is inhuman. Nature is blank. And notice also that in Gainsborough's picture, the human figures there down on the bottom are small, but they're recognizable on a scale with a landscape. Same in Constable's painting at the upper left. But in Friedrich's painting, the human being is standing on top of a mountain looking away from us. So the human being in the picture is taking the same viewpoint as we are, looking at this vast natural landscape here. In fact, this painting by Friedrich was the cover illustration for a edition of Frankenstein, perhaps even the edition that you have right now for this course. We have some other examples here of the sublime, the inhuman landscape. Notice in Brett's painting there's not a single human figure to be seen, nor not a single tree, nothing natural. It could be the surface of a foreign planet, huge and inhuman. This is where some of the scenes in Frankenstein takes place, in this type of landscape. Notice Frederick Church's painting here, and these are, again, in the middle of the 19th century, so this is when the sublime has taken the full measure of artists, and the style of painting these enormous inhuman scenes has become very fashionable. Church's picture of a Mexican volcano and Turner's picture of a snowstorm overwhelming a passenger steamboat in the mouth of a river harbor. You can see that nature here is huge, mysterious, inhuman. And these paintings too, these are not small paintings. These are huge paintings, 8 feet by 10 feet by sometimes 14 by 16 feet. Paintings meant to be hung in exhibition halls, and people would come on weekends and evenings like we go to see a movie to be overwhelmed by these great landscapes and these mysterious places that they had never been. This is what Burke calls the sublime. These are the types of landscapes, the aspects of nature and the kinds of representations of it that cause us to feel fear or terror. Maybe not us sophisticated moderns, but certainly the viewers in the 19th century would have been overwhelmed by these landscapes. This is, in fact, where Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein begins and ends, up in the inhuman wastes, the ice fields and frozen seas of the Arctic. And it represents this abandonment of all that's familiar, all that's domestic, all that's human, for this mysterious world of the Arctic. Shelley says that how gladly, she says, how gladly I would satisfy my fortune, she says. Oh, we're missing this line here. I'll read it to you. How gladly I would satisfy my fortune, my existence, my every hope to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. This is the sea captain, Walton, who is the one who finds Victor Frankenstein wandering around up in the icy wasteland and saying how he would abandon everything that's human, everything that's domestic, everything that is familiar and comfortable in order to advance science, in order to advance human knowledge and conquer the elemental foes of our race, i.e. conquer nature, master it and possess it, like Descartes and Bacon argue we should do. But it's a very much more human-scaled and familiar kind of nature that made William Wordsworth famous as a poet in his own time. Wordsworth was a well-born Englishman, lived in the country in the Lake District of England, and he became as famous as any poet in England had ever been because of his lyrics, which were not written in the high style of Shakespeare or some of the other poetry in the 1600s and 1700s in England. Wordsworth wanted to write in the language of everyday people, in the language of the country people, like that man in the Constable painting in the river with his wagon. And his subjects were not kings and history and not even love so much, but normal scenes of pastoral England. And England, which, by the way, was quickly being overwhelmed at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century by canals and coal mines and factories and mill towns and so forth. So Wordsworth is being a little bit nostalgic maybe when he writes about peasant life in rural England and the Lake District and walking in the woods. Wordsworth emphasizes how nature makes you feel, not the science behind nature, but how nature refreshes you from the hustle and bustle of the cities, from the stress of civilization. And he writes as an individual observer. Think of that man looking out over the sea of fog in the Friedrich painting. He writes from the point of view of the internal viewer, not someone who is looking out over nature on behalf of all of society, but somebody who is responding to it privately and personally. And he tells us that nature is better than culture. You can see the connection here with Rousseau, right? So let's look at this poem, The Tables Turned. And Wordsworth's language is like everyday language. It's also his rhythms are those of English ballads. You know, I can pick almost any standard English ballad tune out of my head and sing these lyrics to you. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come hear the woodland linnet. How sweet is music on my life. There's more of wisdom in it. So you see this is his ballad rhythm. This is popular music. This is before electronic music and recorded music. This is the music of the people. This is, I call it rock and roll. And hark, how blithe the throstle sings. That's the kind of bird. He too is no mean preacher. What is Wordsworth saying? That the bird is something sacred. The bird is like a preacher. Come forth into the light of things, not of religion, not of dogma, not of belief, not of the Bible. Let nature be your teacher. One impulse from a vernal wood, vernal meaning in the season of springtime, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Meaning that nature is wiser and nature is more moral than human beings. Sweet is the lore which nature brings, sings Wordsworth. Our meddling intellect, meaning science, misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. Remember, this is Descartes' method for acquiring truth in science is to take things apart, to disassemble into the basic mathematical components. And Wordsworth says that's you kill nature by taking it apart and studying it and analyzing it. Just experience it. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves, meaning the pages of books. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. That's The Tables Turned, or some stanzas from it that we're reading. And from a later poem of Wordsworth's that we didn't assign to you, but if you like this sort of thing, you can read on the next few pages in Trials of Modernity and see him making another moral claim. Remember, Rousseau says in his essay, "Oh man, I read to you from the book of nature who never lies." And Wordsworth, 50 years ago, is after Rousseau, is writing, "Nature never did betray the heart that loved her." Yes, Wordsworth, famous guy. Now we turn from the beautiful aspect of nature poetry to the sublime aspect of nature poetry, the wild, crazy, mysterious William Blake. So many stories about William Blake today. He was almost unknown in his own lifetime. But Blake was kind of a eccentric commercial artist who lived in London. People who visited him say they would go to his house and he would be running around his house with his wife naked, painting pictures of Adam and Eve. He wrote poetry in his spare time, and he self-published and illustrated his own poems as well. Never made too much money off of them, was never known for a painter, never known as a poet, mostly as a painter and an illustrator. But in his poems, he portrays the sublime side of nature, the amoral, this part of nature that is beyond good or evil. It just is. The mysterious nature, the source, as he argues, of all religions. Most of his famous poems are contained in a collection published during his lifetime that didn't become well known until after he died, called Songs of Innocence and Experience. We're reading 4 poems from that, 3 that are in Trials of Modernity, and the 4th one, which is posted on the website. This is an illustration of Blake's, an example of some of his engravings. Notice just the mysterious, the mystical, the mythological. This has appealed to many artists, specifically the heavy metal band in Norway, Ulver, who's just went away here. Come back, Ulver. It was the heavy metal band of the year in 1998, I believe. And they used the lyrics of William Blake's, and they used this illustration on the cover of their CD. Ulver did. Look up their music, Ulver, and you'll hear Blake's music being sung. So 2 of the poems that we're reading, The Tiger and the Lamb, kind of fit together. Here's a few of the lines from The Lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee clothing of delight, soft as clothing, woolly bright. Little lamb, I'll tell thee, we are called by his name, I a child, and thou a lamb. Little lamb, God bless thee. So this is Blake's evocation of the beautiful side of life, the picturesque, the small, the human scale, and then match this with some of the lines from The Tiger. He reads, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? Did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? What's Blake talking about here? Blake's suggesting that nature is beyond good and evil. Nature is beyond this little, soft, woolly, bright lamb. In just the same way that nature can be small and human scaled, nature can also be huge and savage and threatening. And did the same creator, did the same nature create both an innocent little lamb and this bloodthirsty tiger? You can read the rest of this poem and ask yourself, what are some of the basic questions that Blake is asking about good and evil, about human nature, and about the morality of nature? Where does good and evil come from? Is it natural? One of the Blake poems that's not in the Trials of Modernity collection, we've posted on the module for you. This is one of Blake's political poems, and you can see the connection here with Rousseau's complaint that poverty is not natural. It's a poem about a chimney sweep, one of these thousands of little boys and girls who wandered around London crying, sweep, 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 because only they were small enough to fit down the chimneys of the thousands and thousands of buildings in London that needed to be swept. And of course they would die doing this very unhealthy work. And we have here Blake's argument that this too is unnatural. If the little lamb is the innocent little child, the tiger is this system which is forcing these children into this line of work. A little black thing among the snow. It's cold in London, it's winter, and this child is covered with soot, crying, weep, weep, in notes of woes. They cry, sweep, sweep, but Blake has it, weep, weep. Where are thy father and mother? Say, why aren't you at home being taken care of? Oh, says the child, they are both gone up to the church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath, dancing in the meadow, and smiled among the snow, because I was a happy child, they clothed me in these clothes of death, these soot-covered chimney-sweep clothes, and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy, dance and sing, because it's hard to keep children down, right? They think they have done me no injury, and they are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. This is Blake saying that the system is not taking care of the most innocent and feeble and delicate of human beings, that the children are being exploited by this system, and this is not natural, and that religion and politics and even the parents are colluding to oppress these little children. No child labor laws in London, of course, and for many people, the income that these child chimney sweeps generated was essential to their survival. But you can see the politics here, similar to those at the end of Rousseau's essay. And this, along with The Tiger and the Lamb, are certainly some poems that Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, would have been very, very familiar with. And that's what we'll be turning to next. This novel written by an 18-year-old woman, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Frankenstein, still a thing after all these years. Thanks for listening to this essay here. It's a new kind of software, not quite familiar with it, but I guess it's better to show up this way than not at all. Thank you.